Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Sparkle English, where I help you improve your level of English. My name is Jennifer, and today I'm going to talk to you about verbs. You're going to learn the difference between main verbs and auxiliary verbs. So first of all, verbs are one of the 8 parts of speech in the English language. There are nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. I have a complete series on the parts of speech, which I've linked you to in the description below. But today, we're going to talk about verbs, in particular, main verbs and auxiliary verbs. And a verb is a word used to describe an action, state, or occurrence in a sentence. For example, the doctor works at the hospital. Works is the verb. It is telling us what the doctor is doing. The girls played football yesterday. Played is the verb. Again, it describes the action in the sentence. And let's briefly talk about action verbs versus state verbs. Action verbs describe physical or mental actions, and state verbs describe situations or states rather than actions. Let's look at some examples. Bethany runs every morning. Runs is an action verb. It's a physical action. You can imagine Bethany running. We are baking cookies. The children painted at school. He is thinking about his future. In this case, thinking is an action verb because someone is actively engaging in thought. In this moment, he, the man, is sitting down and thinking about his future. Whereas state verbs describe situations or states rather than actions, and we use them to describe a state of being, emotion, or an opinion. For example, Bernardo loves protein shakes. That bike belongs to me. Jesse knows the answer. Your idea seems impossible. And state verbs do not show actions, but rather describe situations or conditions that are static. So we would not say Bernardo is loving protein shakes because this is static. He always loves them. It's not something that's happening in this moment. However, in this video, we are focusing on main verbs and auxiliary verbs. So both action verbs and state verbs are considered main verbs. And main verbs are the primary verbs in a sentence that describe the main action or state of being. They tell you what the subject of the sentence is doing or being or feeling or thinking. And auxiliary verbs are also known as helping verbs, and they are used together with a main verb to show the verb's tense, to form a negative or a question, or to add emphasis. Let's look at some examples. My nephew plays video games. Plays is the main verb, the only verb in the sentence. Now let's look at this sentence. My nephew is playing video games. If you know verb tenses, the first sentence is in the present simple tense. We only have the verb plays. But the second sentence is in the present continuous, and the verb is playing. This is the main verb. But we do have a helping verb, an auxiliary verb, is, from the verb to be. So the auxiliary verb helps the main verb to show the verb's tense. Here's another example. We went to the cinema last night. The main verb is went, the past simple form of the verb go. Now let's look at this question. Did you go to the cinema last night? We have the main verb, go, but in order to ask a question, we have to use an auxiliary verb, did, Did you go to the cinema last night? When we form negatives or questions, we usually use auxiliary verbs. Tina speaks Italian and French. We have the main verb speaks. She doesn't speak Spanish. In this sentence, we have the main verb speak, but in order to make it negative, we have the auxiliary doesn't, does not. So now let's take a look at the primary auxiliary verbs. We have be, have, and do. And all of these verbs can be main verbs, but also auxiliary verbs. Be is used to make the present continuous and the past continuous tenses. It's also used for the passive voice. For example, they are studying. We have the main verb studying, and are is a form of the verb to be. And in this case, it is an auxiliary verb helping the main verb to form the present continuous tense. I was exercising. This is the past continuous tense. The main verb is exercising. Was is the past form of the verb to be, and it helps us form the past continuous tense. In the last example, my TV was damaged. This is in the passive voice. The main verb is damaged, and was is the auxiliary verb helping us form the passive voice. You can check out my lesson on the active and passive voice as well. Now let's look at examples of have. Have is used to make the present perfect and the past perfect tenses. For example, we have finished our homework. The main verb, finished. Have is an auxiliary verb we use to make the present perfect. My parents had already eaten dinner. Here we have the past perfect tense. The main verb is eaten, and had is the auxiliary verb helping us form the past perfect. Now let's look at examples of do. Do is used to form negatives, questions, and emphatic statements. For example, do you drink tea or coffee? The main verb is drink, and do is used along with the main verb to ask a question. My sister doesn't like country music. The main verb is like, but to make this negative, we need does combined with not, doesn't. And the last example, you do still want to get married, right? So in this example, the main verb is want, and the auxiliary do is used for emphasis. The speaker is affirming or confirming the statement and expects a response. This sentence would still be correct if do was not in the sentence, but do provides emphasis. You do still want to get married, right? So now let's talk about auxiliary verbs in compound tenses. So sometimes several auxiliary verbs are used together with different tenses. For example, in the present perfect continuous, the past perfect continuous, and also the future perfect continuous, as well as the future continuous and other tenses. For example, I have been waiting for an hour. We have the main verb, waiting, but we have two auxiliary verbs, have been, and we need two auxiliary verbs to form this tense. Kent had been working there for 10 years before he quit. Working is the main verb, but we have two auxiliary verbs, had been. And in the future perfect continuous, we have three auxiliary verbs. By next year, we will have been living here for a decade. Will, have, and been are all auxiliary verbs that support the main verb, living. So now let's talk about how we can identify a main verb versus an auxiliary verb, because sometimes it can be difficult. Remember that main verbs stand alone in meaning, while auxiliary verbs support them. We're going to do some comparisons of verbs that can be difficult. Let's look at this example. Ben usually does his homework after school. Well, does is a main verb. And I know I just taught you that do, have, and be are auxiliary verbs. However, they can function as main verbs. Because if we remove this, we have no verb. Ben usually his homework after school. That makes no sense. So even though many times do or does is an auxiliary verb, it also functions as a main verb. There are many expressions in English that we use with the verb do. Do my homework, do the dishes, do the laundry. Now let's look at an example with an auxiliary verb. Ben doesn't do his homework after school. In this example, do is still the main verb, but doesn't is the auxiliary verb that supports the main verb do. It makes the sentence negative. So if you have difficulty, ask yourself, what is the main verb? And if there is no other verb, like in this first sentence here, you know it's the main verb. Here's another example. We have a new pet hamster. Have is a main verb because there is no other verb in this sentence. But in this example, the students have finished their presentations. The main verb is finished. Have finished is the present perfect. And have in this sentence is an auxiliary verb because it helps form the present perfect. Okay, so now we're going to have a quiz on main verbs and auxiliary verbs. You must identify the main verbs and or auxiliary verbs in these sentences. Number 1, Donald has an amazing voice. Number 2, the boys are playing football at the park. Number 3, all of the food was eaten. Number 4, do you have plans tomorrow afternoon? Number 5, my brother has been studying for his exam all week. Number 6, have you seen The Lord of the Rings? Number 7, my son did his homework last night. Okay, so number 1, let's identify the main verb. Here, the main verb is has. I'm going to put an M for main. There is no auxiliary verb in this sentence. Number 2, the main verb is playing. And we do have an auxiliary verb. The auxiliary verb is are. It is helping us form the present continuous. Now, number 3 is a little more difficult. The main verb is eaten. This is in the passive voice. Eaten is the past participle of the verb eat. And the auxiliary verb is was. It's a form of the verb be that is used to create the passive voice. Now, in number 4, the main verb is have. And the auxiliary verb here is do. Do is helping the main verb to form a question. Now, what about number 5? The main verb is studying. And in this sentence, we have 2 auxiliary verbs, has and been. We have 2 auxiliary verbs used to create the present perfect continuous, has been studying. Number 6, the main verb is seen. And this is the present perfect tense. So the auxiliary verb is have, which is used to form the present perfect tense and ask a question. Have you seen The Lord of the Rings? And finally, number 7, we only have one verb, one main verb, did. My son did his homework last night. And this is a main verb because there's no other verb in this sentence. And as we discussed, sometimes do and have and be are main verbs, and other times they are auxiliary verbs. So always try to locate the main verb or any verb in the sentence, and then you can determine which is the main verb and which is the auxiliary verb, if there are any in each sentence. Okay, so let me know how many you got correct out of 7. And if you had any difficulties, feel free to ask me in the comment section. I recommend you check out my full playlist, which I've linked you to in the description below, on all of my videos on the 8 parts of speech in English. I will see you all in my next lesson.